Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Can hear you, yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So my name is Nicole Cooke. I'm the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Associate Professor at the School of Library and Information Science at the University of South Carolina. So welcome to all to the Augusta Baker Diversity Lecture Series that we're doing as part of a class entitled Diversity in Libraries. And I am so happy to have Stacey Collins with us today to be our concluding speaker for the series this semester. Stacey is one of my favorite people on the planet, and Stacey is a librarian at Simmons University in Boston. And so happy Stacey can join us today. A couple years ago, I was doing a special issue of a journal called Library Trends, and I was looking for articles that would give us an update, if you will, about where we are in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the LIS profession. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Lorna Peterson, Dr. Peterson is a retired LIS professor from SUNY Buffalo in their library program. In the mid 90s, she wrote a series of articles talking about the importance of language when we're talking about diversity issues. And I really wanted an update to this article to be included in this issue. And Stacy and I are friends, and I saw Stacy ranting, if you will, about something on Facebook. And Stacy was talking about, this exact thing about why it's important for us to be precise in our language when we're talking about these issues. So, as I do, I messaged and I said, "Hey, Stacy, I need you to write an article for me." And Stacy graciously obliged. There was some, "Oh no, I can't do this," and then I said, "Oh yes, you can." And fortunately, Stacy wrote a brilliant article, really bringing us up to date and really emphasizing why language is oh so important when we're doing this work. And so whenever I can, I invite Stacy to talk about this article and all of the other fabulous work being done at Simmons. Hopefully Stacy will mention her LibGuides and, really a lot of advocacy work for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So welcome, my friend. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, awesome. That's not hard to live up to at all. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes? All right, awesome. I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Okay. Everybody seeing what I'm seeing? Big green slide. All right. Okay, so yes, I turned a Facebook rant into an article, and if I can do it, anybody can. So go sorting through your recent rants, especially now that everybody's trapped indoors. So the diversity problem is what I call this, somewhat ironically. Ironically, one, because this language about the diversity problem is something I'm going to talk about why it's actually sort of hindering us addressing this very problem. But also because in the article that I wrote, I actually used the word diversity like 11 times. And if by the end of it, if you've read it, but if by the end of it you're sort of feeling like, wow, the word diversity doesn't even look like a word anymore, or my goodness, I'm not even sure what it really is supposed to mean anymore, that's part of the point. And in fact, we do overuse this word quite a bit in our industry. But first, let me back up and give you a little bit more about me. Oh, look, you can't even see me in that picture. So, but here I am in real life on your screen. So who am I? So I am the librarian for social work and for children's literature at Simmons University. That probably sounds like those don't have a lot in common, and in fact, they don't. And usually they wouldn't be necessarily slapped together. But like so much of what I do in the various spheres of my life and work, these two things have me in common, my interest in them in common, but they also have diversity, equity, and inclusion as issues and also as movements in common, which is pretty cool. I'm also an anti-racism collaborative facilitator. The Anti-Racism Collaborative operates in the greater Boston area. And so as a facilitator, I offer courses, I do workshops, work with clients, etc. I've actually had the chance to work with a couple of libraries to have this conversation, which is pretty cool. And in general, I'm an anti-oppression educator. I've talked about these kinds of issues, not necessarily language specifically, but sort of overarching kind of problems in the reviewing world, in the publishing world, often within children's literature and librarianship. And by now, I'm sure a bunch of people are tired of hearing me talk about it, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. And so one other little bit about me that has changed since the last time I got to talk about this for Dr. Cooke's class is that last September, I also became a mom. This is my little one, Reed, over here on the right-hand side, reading a book, of course. Reed loves to sort of like help me sort of suss out best ways to talk about this. And when I start over talking about it, they just sort of yell at me, which is the best feedback you're really going to get from any audience. So the article that I wrote that Dr. Cooke was referring to is Language, Power, and Oppression in the LIS Diversity Void. And like said, started from a Facebook rant where I was talking about how the way that people sort of talked about issues never seemed to come around and actually look at how we were talking about these issues. And so language being ignored was starting to make problems pop up in even when we're trying to address issues, big issues like oppression, racism, ableism, etc. So the first thing I want to start with is diversity and how it sort of has been misidentified. And I didn't really do this in the article, or I sort of did it in a little, in a sort of different organization. But it's not just the fact that we overuse this word. We overuse it, and also the definition that we're working with becomes slippery, right? So when you stop defining your terms and assume that everybody in the room knows what you mean, you very quickly find out that in fact everybody does not know what you mean, or is assuming their own thing in their head. And this is where we get things where folks say, well, isn't diversity of thought just as important as racial diversity? Or actually, we don't have enough, cisgender heterosexual men in our organization. Shouldn't we get more of them? And those conversations, that concept of what diversity is becomes equal to these efforts that we're trying to do that actually impact like centuries old systemic oppression. So a few folks here on this slide who have talked about this in various ways. So Dr. Joyce Bell and Dr. Douglas Hartman framed diversity as what they called happy talk. This idea that you could talk about the benefits of this great thing, this spice of life, diversity. And nobody really got into the specifics of what they meant by diversity, but you talked vaguely about how it was good to have diversity, and diversity was this great way to enrich everything, and it became this very happy, very glowy, nice conversation where nobody had to have the sort of hard conversation and had to get uncomfortable about anything. It was just, oh yeah, diversity is great. Dr. D.L. Stewart did a piece for Inside Higher Education, where they basically described diversity as a term, diversity and inclusion rhetoric overall, as insufficient. Like that's the word they sort of place on it, where what we really need is rhetoric and conversations that are engaging with equity and justice, not simply diversity and inclusion. That those terms and the concepts that they ultimately frame, specifically within higher education, are asking questions that don't go deep enough. I believe one of them is diversity asks the question of who's in the room, and equity asks who wants to be in the room but can't get in. Dr. Sarah Ahmed, one of my favorite folks, and one of my favorite blogs to follow. She has an entire book about this, but she actually uses her blog to sort of expand on some of what she's written and published, which is great. And damage limitation was one blog post that she had, I believe it might have been February of last year, talking about how, again, particularly within higher education, you have diversity framed within the concept of PR. Right? If you have a diversity issue, if you have a lack of diversity, it's only really a problem if folks notice and suddenly they start, not coming to your school or saying that there's a problem in your school, and suddenly you look bad because of this lack. It's not a problem in and of itself. It's a problem when it gets noticed. And when she says damage limitation, it means that diversity efforts in and of themselves become a way to sort of counter this PR problem. It also means that the people who continue the problem, the people who continue bringing it up, the people who continue to challenge the way things are done, the people who continue to say, hey, this isn't right, instead of being people who are bringing a problem up, they themselves become the problem, right? So it's like if it's a visual, if it's an optics issue, if it's the way you look to the outside world, then the people who keep bringing it up are your bigger problem than the actual problem itself. So also not cool as a framing. And then the last one here is one that pops up in LIS a lot in different libraries and also in our field writ large, and I'm going to talk more about it in a second, is this idea of using diversity as shorthand. And this is, again, back to, we just assume everybody knows what we're talking about when we say diversity, or what's missing, or what's needed. And you end up having weird uses of the word. This one, the one that I put in here is my favorite, diverse as a group adjective, right? You say like, oh, what a diverse book, or what a diverse speaker, or we need more diverse speakers. And it's like, well, diverse is an adjective that describes a group. You have to have multiple things for them to even have the possibility of being diverse. One thing can't be diverse, right? And it becomes a way to use diversity as a way to not say race, or not say disability, or not say anything of those words that sort of push against the happy talk. They start getting into that not so fun and that not so comfortable. And then Dr. Cooke mentioned Dr. Lorna Peterson. So this is one of my favorite quotes of hers, where she says that a lot of folks, particularly folks that use diversity in this way over and over again and let this definition slip, come around to what she calls the interior design theory of diversity, which is that an environment is improved by the addition of color. But true, right? It's this idea that without addressing any kind of systemic issues, we can just add the people we're missing and that will fix it. And that unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, doesn't work at all. We're going to talk about why. Okay, I apologize. I'm realizing that like maybe the tops of these slides are a little bit cut off. So, but I believe I can make the slides available after the fact so you can see them in their entirety. But this one is systems thinking and systems change. So when I say systems thinking, what I mean is thinking about how there are structures and cultural systems in place that continue oppression from institution to institution, generation to generation. And it's why we still have problems that are in fact centuries old. And why those problems like racism, like ableism, like transmisia, et cetera, are so adaptable year to year, decade to decade, situation to situation, and quite frankly, country to country, et cetera. And hopefully folks recognize this quote here in the middle. This is the top billing of on our code of ethics, the very first one, and you'll notice that we give our top billing to equity, providing the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate use and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. And so despite the fact that we give top billing to equity, we really don't dig into what providing equitable service and providing equitable access really means, what equity really means. Equity is not an antithesis to diversity, but it is it is connected to diversity and yet never really talked about. It is an essential component if we're attempting to address lack of diversity. Equity is an essential component, and we don't talk about it enough because it has that systemic piece attached to it. Equity is for me, it's far preferable as a discussion point for addressing issues of homogeneity and issues of needing to change the way things are done, because equity is context specific, right? Equity is about fairness, and fairness is always context specific. It's historically informed, right? It's going to be specific to each institution, but it's also going to have things in common even among different institutions, disciplines, fields, etc. And it's about addressing things at a systemic level, because that's the only way, systemically is the only way that you can maintain equity enough to actually get changes in diversity and inclusion and whatnot. And so when we look at equity, and when I wrote this article looking at sort of this issue of diversity instead of equity, the diversity void, the dearth of diversity, issues of power and issues of language were sort of what came bubbling to the surface as what was in common with so much of what LIS is trying to do, but also other fields and other institutions that have tried this work without sort of going after equity, but going after diversity instead. And so I'm just going to sort of walk through what happened. So the diversity void, what I mean when I say that is a lack of diversity, but not just a lack in the sense of we're missing people and therefore we should put them in, but other things, actual workings of the system, sort of cogs in the wheel of the system that keep this void intact. So over here on the left, we have the noun of void, right? So void is actually a noun and a verb. It's very cool. Words are cool. So when we talk about the sort of emptiness or gap of diversity in our field, we're usually referring to our workforce, right? We don't have enough diversity in our workforce. I believe we are 88% white in our field. We don't. I don't know if we have a good count of how straight we are, of how straight we are, how cisgender we are, how non-disabled we are, et cetera, et cetera. But this idea that we have many folks who enjoy the same privilege of identity in our workforce. We also have a void of diversity in our collections, our policies, our curriculum in our MLIS programs, and among our students who are present in those programs. Under the verb of diversity, or a diversity void, voiding means to invalidate. Anybody that's had the fun of working a retail job, maybe not so fun now, has had to at some point need to void a transaction for a customer who has a problem or whatnot. And voiding literally means to invalidate or to undo things. And we have this happening in our field as well. It happens actually most of the time through language and the way that we talk about our field. So ways that we invalidate things that make diversity hard to maintain are concepts like good librarianship. If you were to ask the average librarian what a good librarian is, you're going to get a lot of things that have to do with a certain perspective, a certain viewpoint, and certain amounts of access when it comes to existence. So good librarianship is remarkably white. It is remarkably middle class. Even this idea of being unbiased or non-personal in your work, which is meant to be a good thing in that we're not bringing our personal biases to work, so we're making sure that everybody gets information, even if we don't think they necessarily should have it. That doesn't matter. What I personally think doesn't matter. You asked for information, I'm here to provide it for you. Is meant to be what that idea holds, but it completely erases the fact that there are folks who exist in an identity that can't simply be compartmentalized from their work. While I was a student worker at Simmons, I came in onto my shift for the reference desk. It was 8 o'clock at night. I had the 8 to midnight shift. And a student came up to me and said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad that you're here. I've been waiting for 4 hours." Actually, I think it was 5. I've been waiting for 5 hours for a Black person or a person of color to come on this desk so that I could ask this research question about Black Lives Matter, because they weren't not comfortable asking that question as a Black student to a white service member, one of our white student workers, or one of our white librarians. And it's not to say that those librarians wouldn't have been perfectly capable and happy to help them, but that personal piece was so important to them that they literally held their question and sat still until somebody that looked like them came on the desk. So that concept of good librarianship and what it sort of means often erases those important pieces. The MLIS or no MLIS question is one that goes on and on forever. And folks who have shelled out the money for an MLIS often are on the side of, yes, we must have an MLIS. But MLISs do in fact cost money. You all are sitting here, you know it. And the folks that don't have that option of either going into student loan debt or having other monetary options that allow them to have access to an MLIS, that means that they have an effective ceiling into what they can do in a library. And it means that there is real, when it comes to our workforce, real perspectives, viewpoints, voices that we are absolutely missing because we simply don't allow them in or allow them above certain levels. And then the last one, library should be neutral, is people have been far more eloquent about it than I could possibly be in this moment. But I will say we are not. And the very idea that we should be kind of actually doesn't work with that equity piece and that first ethics that I read. It's actually not a neutral position to say that you're going to provide information in an equitable way to everyone, no matter what. So language becomes this linchpin of why we are missing so much enriching diversity, from both in the sense of physically having it among our peers and among our collections, but also in the way that we talk about what is good for our field and what is right for our profession. Okay. So all of this as it happens, whoops, sorry, clicked away from the window. All of this as it happens, of course, as it happens, oppression, as folks have probably heard the phrase that oppression is prejudice plus power. You maybe saw it in that picture of me up there in the previous slide. And it is. And so this issue of language that is contributing to lack of diversity, is contributing to stymieing our attempts to fix our issues around lack of diversity, also hinges on this question of power. And when we eliminate interrogations of power from the conversation, we essentially make our conversations toothless. The conversation itself will probably end up going nowhere, and any action that comes from it, the committees that are formed, the ideas that are generated that aren't grounded in that interrogation of power, are going to end up not solving the problem, but kind of just doing something nice, maybe at best doing something nice for temporarily, right? And I'm sorry you can't see this question, so I'm going to read it out. What it says is, what does power look like in a library, in an archive, or in LIS as a field? And this is actually a question I'd like folks to take a second to think about and maybe respond in the chat. So what does power look like in a library? Or for folks that aren't currently working in a library, what does it look like in your program? Who has power? What does it mean to have power? What does it look like to wield power? It looks like a person in a suit sometimes, absolutely, right? Dress for the job you want, dress professionally. Not having a say in our programs, that's a great example of not having power, right? If you don't have the ability to say what a program is or isn't, includes or doesn't include, absolutely. And the folks that do have that say absolutely have power. Security guards at the door, absolutely. Who gets in, who doesn't get in, who's in jeopardy of being thrown out, what's on display, who makes the decision about what's on display. Power's having control over something, any little thing, absolutely. Middle or upper class, absolutely. Deciding where the monies go, purchasing, more or less the same, yep. Who holds the money, yep. Collection development, voices with the most weight, what decisions get made. All right, fantastic. So a lot of this is actually sort of circled around that this general idea of somebody being able to make a decision. Power in our field in particular often looks like who gets to make a decision. And different people get to make decisions for different reasons. Some decisions are bigger than others, although it really kind of depends on your perspective. Is it not a big decision to select which books are going to go on your children's room shelves versus a decision of renovating the library? Are those really in a hierarchy? Yeah. So just a thought. And my second question, this one you don't have to answer, but I do want folks to sort of think about it. So if this is what power looks like, decision making, and often revolving around money, but sometimes also just who has voice. Thank you for that contribution. This idea of who gets to say something and be heard at all. So if that's what power looks like, if that's what wielding power is in our world, then think about who has this power. Right, in our current state of affairs, who has this power, and And not only who has it, but who's kept from it. And also, how are they kept from it, if you can think about it. So if you do work in a library, think about who has those kinds of decision-making powers. What do they look like? What do they seem to have in common with one another? And who doesn't have that power? And are there reasons? Are there reasons why? Are they stated? Are they written down somewhere? Is it unspoken law, etc.? So just something to think about as we go along. Now, I have two, and I'm sorry for the big blocks of text. I know that's no fun on the slide. But these are from the Culture of White Supremacy, which folks maybe have heard of before. If you Google Culture of White Supremacy, it is the first thing that pops up. It's actually, I think it's over a decade old now. But it remains extremely useful and outlines different facets of the ways that white supremacy has been embedded into organizational culture. And it doesn't look like people, coming to work in sheets with hoods over their head. And it doesn't look like there are no Black people or any people of color in this organization. And it certainly doesn't look like we're going to use terrible terminology to refer to these people, although you do still have that sometimes in different organizations, though not normally like, on the brochure for come and join us. What you have it is embedded into structures and workflows, right? So two examples that sort of hinge on this question of power is power hoarding and paternalism. And as you can see, right, power hoarding is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that power is somehow limited, right? It's this scarce resource power, and only so many people can have it, because if everybody had the power, there wouldn't be enough power to go around. Those with power, those with decision-making power, as an example, often feel threatened when their decisions are questioned, or when people suggest changes of how things could be done, because they see it as being told that their leadership is questionable, or that their holding of the power is somehow not a good thing. And then those with power often assume that because they have the best interest of the organization at heart, whatever that means, that they have the ability to make decisions, and they should be vested with power because they are going to do the best with it. And that anybody who suggests a change in how that organization is run, or how the power is distributed, must be coming from a place that's not informed, or that you just don't know enough, you don't have enough institutional knowledge, whatever, that you're being overly emotional. We can all talk about how much that's a weird insult to throw at someone, because we're humans with emotions. Or the idea that you kind of just don't know what you're talking about, right? That maybe you're too new, too fresh out of school, or too fresh, maybe just generally too fresh as a human. Like, hey, I've been a human 20 years longer than you, so you don't know what you're talking about, is also an interesting argument, right? The second one here is paternalism, and this is sort of how power gets wielded, not just held in an organization. And if this is feeling sort of like, oh, this feels familiar, that's because paternalism is something that's present in almost any organization that has a hierarchy, because that's what hierarchies are for. So decision making, whatever that looks like, might be about money, might be about something else, is clear to those who with power, and unclear to those without it, right? So decisions are being made, but there's lack of transparency around that. Maybe decisions are sort of made and you took no part in them. You're just being handed down a decision and you have no idea what the thinking was behind it, or why folks think it's the best. It's unclear to the folks who don't make the decisions, but have to sort of, I won't say endure, but who these decisions impact. Those with power think they're capable of making decisions for and in the interest of those without power, often without consulting them, right? They just know what's best because they hold the power, and they've been holding the power for a while, and they're good at it, right? So like, I know what I'm doing. I can totally make a decision that's best for all of you without really consulting any of you. And then the last one is those with power don't think it's important or necessary to understand the viewpoint or experience of those for whom they are making decisions. This just as a non-specifically library example, this often happens when institutions of any kind, any organization, is making a decision about their employer offered health insurance. Like, it's just a question that most of the time is not given. You don't get a vote in what your employer picks as health insurance most of the time. It's a decision made entirely sort of without your consent, even though it's literally the health insurance you will have to use. It's just, which is, I find interesting. Anyway, So power hoarding and paternalism is one way that the issue of power dynamics sort of shows up, and it also hinges on language, right? We can see how language sort of threads through this, right? The question of who gets to make decisions and how do you go about challenging that in a way that doesn't sound like you're being emotional or sound like you're being, I don't know, petulant, right? Yes. So this image I have over here on the left is actually from a talk that Chris Berg, who's the director of libraries at MIT, gave a couple of years ago. It's also on her blog. The concentric circles are meant to represent how individual librarians there in the middle have impact on their workplace, has impact on their local community, and local consortia, perhaps, of libraries, has impact on the LAS field, has impact on sort of the global community of libraries and also our global community of humans. Now, missing from this is LIS, mainly because Chris Berg made this, and Chris Berg does not have an MLIS, which I love. But this idea of shifting power to address is the only way to systemically address any of these problems that we have in LIS surrounding the diversity void. And you can see very quickly how changing issues of power at one level has ripple effects on all these other levels, which means if we're concentrating on power shifts, right? If we're not concentrating on power, then we don't end up impacting enough. If we're saying, oh, I'm going to put something really beautiful and diverse together for a display, for a particular display, but we as a staff are not going to have any conversations about power, about who makes those decisions or why till this point they have been less than diverse, etc. Then we're not going to see something that impacts maybe beyond our own community or beyond our own individual library staff. We're going to see something that's sort of very small and probably very temporary in its impact. If we want something larger that actually starts to shift the way that these systems work, then we have to see shifts in power. Okay. I swear I went through this to see about what was cutting off, and now it's weird and different. So I'm sorry, but I will read everything. So now, right to the specific question of language. So how does language end up reinforcing some of these problems that we have? This problem of not questioning power and these problems of sort of the resulting dearth of diversity. So, like I say in the article, much of what libraries ethically, right? Ethically, in the best and brightest of worlds, we are an institution, a field that is dedicated to addressing issues of inequity, right? If we're giving top billing to equity in our ethical code, it's because we want inequity to be squashed and challenged in our own field, but in our impact on our community. But the problem, I guess, is the way to say it. The problem is that if we don't consider language in that sort of push to challenge inequity, we're missing a huge piece of how inequity actually operates. Right? Much of the inequity in our country, our very young country, was written into existence, and you see some examples of that over here on the right. Is that the notion even of our Constitution, right? This document that nobody can actually change. You have to write amendments. You can't actually change the original language. It is forever. Inequity was written. Inequity between human beings who are all human beings. Inequity between them was written into existence, and we've had to add amendments to fix it. Right? Our Constitution and the laws that extend from it are sort of couched, entrenched in this idea that some people deserve more power just because. And some people deserve less power or no power, or sometimes not even, the designation of human, just because the people with power said they should, and wrote it down, and said, we're going to write this down, and it's going to be the basis for more laws that are going to be written down, and going to be used to impact people's lives, sometimes even end their lives. Yes. So we also have this concept here. It's called the the deficit paradigm or the deficit model. Folks have maybe heard the word achievement gap, especially if you have an interest in school libraries. This is often something talked about in K through 12 schools. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but this idea of using language to sort of say that some folks are less able, less capable than others is another way that language sort of, even when we're trying to address this issue, right? The achievement gap was meant with the best of intentions of, let's identify this thing and talk about how we can help these students that are on the wrong side of the achievement gap, ends up reinforcing the very reason why they're over there. I'm going to talk about language as a system failsafe in just a second. But I want to talk about this this bit at the bottom, the critical discourse analysis, which I do a very light critical discourse analysis light in my article. But it sort of holds, right, this this idea that language is socially constructed, right? That it's not somehow this like objectively true or neutral tool. It is something that we construct as we go along. And because of that, different groups could be as small as your friend group, could be as, as large as an entire nation or the globe. But organizations and institutions, as much as they are groups of people, also create language practices. And the fun part is that while your institution is creating language practices specific to its institution, think about how LIS uses words that other people don't understand, right? Think about what catalog means to the library world and what it means to somebody has no idea what the running of a library is or means. Right, so words literally take on specific meanings. We construct our own language as part of our institution, but the thing is as we're constructing our language, the language is constructing us, right? It's the idea of jargon, right? So like, you are a librarian if you know what cataloging means in a library. That's part of being a librarian, is you learn the language. So this is a very cool idea in critical discourse analysis. If you ever go and find some, you can do it to almost any kind of organization, group, institution, what have you. Any sort of body of criticism in particular, go through and see like what language do they use in common and where does it come from and why do folks sort of just naturally understand this meaning and whatnot. It's very cool because it really does sort of like unveil this notion of how any group is socially constructed as they go along. But the critical discourse analysis light that I do in the article has a lot to do with sort of unmasking where language that uses diversity and inclusion, that happy talk rhetoric that I was mentioning before, where it actually helps contribute to oppression, right? It's not just this, oh, well, we didn't go far enough in how we were talking, and so we accidentally didn't have any impact, and that's sad. No, we actually have language that sounds good, but that is in fact doing a great deal of bad. So that one example that I used in the article is from a piece where a gentleman was trying to explain a gaffe that a news anchor had made, where she said she used the term colored person or colored people instead of people of color. And there was very justified outrage about this, but then a lot of people sort of coming back and say, I don't understand what exactly is the big deal. These sound very much the same to me. And so a person wrote an article to talk about, let me like quickly explain, like euphemisms are things and they're very slippery and it's very, let's sort of talk through this so you understand why it was bad. And the rant that I did on Facebook that led to this article in the first place was to talk about how this person used a lot of equivalencies that was in the name of explaining, presumably to white folks who did not understand why colored person was not okay to say. That in trying to explain it, in trying to sort of simplify and make this as accessible as possible to folks who do not live in a world where people who do not hold an identity where they are actually oppressed for their skin color. Trying to explain why this is a problem, even though these two phrases look very much the same. So one of the quotes from there I have on here, it says, since colored person means the same thing as people of color, why is it wrong to say it? And that right there, which was one of the first sentences in the article, has already established a problem and has already established a white supremacist point of view. in part because it is creating this false equivalency. It is in fact not the same thing to say that colored person versus people of color, right? And any person of color will tell you, yeah, no, that's not the same thing at all. And the thing is, even if you don't understand why, yes, these words are the actual words themselves, devoid of any meaning, absolutely look the same. They are very, very similar. People of color actually requires like more syllables. So why, it's, but the problem is language devoid of meaning isn't anything. So as soon as we add meaning back in, right, these become vastly different phrases. And even if you, for some reason, missed, I don't know, the entirety of the 20th century, and you don't know that racism is a thing, and that one great way to be racist and a jerk is to call a person of color a colored person. Even if you don't know that, all you have to do is believe people of color when they say, this one's not okay, this one is okay. And since you're using it to describe me, I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm the authority of what it's okay to describe me with. All you have to do is believe them, take their word for it, and just go with it. But we have, again, white supremacy says, I don't need to take your word for it because I don't, I don't think so. And because I don't think it, and because I don't have to experience it, I get to decide for you, right? That comes back to that paternalism piece of I can decide what language is and isn't oppressive, even though I don't experience that oppression. Okay, so coming back over here to language as a system, failsafe. I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around the slide a little bit. We have that happy talk piece of where, because we're just, diversity is the spice of life, and it's so enriching and it's so great, and we never actually have to say the word race, and that makes me even more happy. Those are all pieces of sort of not saying and getting to the meat of the matter. But happy talk also encapsulates this idea of using talking as a way to not take action. It's also a way of using talk and pretending that talking about it is action. That's where you have a committee that's formed that has a lot of conversations and then doesn't do anything, or they make a lot of recommendations and none of them are actually, applied. Happy talk also naturalizes and reinforces that things like a white supremacist viewpoint and defaults. I'm going to get to defaults in just a second. So this question of language as a system fails safe, equating colored person and person of color as phrases is a system failsafe, right? Only in a racist system could we say that a racist epithet is the same as a a label that the folks who experience oppression have chosen for themselves. Only in one where only in one of white supremacist perspective could we say that these two things are the same thing. And the person who wrote this article and used this quote as sort of their jumping off place to explain had the best of intentions of trying to explain why this one is not okay and this was okay. So please don't use the one that's not okay, and please use the one that is okay. Like, very great intentions, and ideally a good result. But the place that they started from was one of seeding a white supremacist point. And so in that way, this use of language became this system failsafe for white supremacy. And I talk about this in the article as well, is that you can have the very best of intentions and your actions can have the very, best of results and objectives in mind. But when you're not interrogating your language and when you're letting sort of these things slide by without questioning them, these systems of oppression are extremely robust and extremely sophisticated, and they operate whether you want them to or not. And so the moment you stop interrogating is the moment where oppression sort of thrives and lives. So even though you've had this great intention, you've now sort of sabotaged it by starting from a white supremacist perspective. Okay. Oh, and I'd be remiss to not mention this quote from this tweet. I've never lost sight that my freedom as a Black American is an amendment, not a founding principle in our Constitution. That was what I was talking about a little earlier. Okay. So looking at LIS language specifically, I've already like mentioned examples of this. I don't have to spend much time with this. And you being part of the LIS community, either as students or also library staff, know what this is. So I divided in the article, and I've divided it here between what I call the language of oppression and oppressive language, just to keep it very similar, just to keep it as confusing as possible, right? But again, to get at this idea that context matters, that meaning matters, and that meaning is always context specific, and that meaning that language derives meaning from reference, context, and greater systems of connection, right? So when I say language of oppression, it is not the same thing as oppressive language, because what I mean by a language of oppression is what you could also call oppression literacy. The idea of what language, what often more language, more precise language, more time-consuming language, more words you have to type out into your paper, into your dissertation, that identifies, unveils, shows you oppression operating, or that specifically works against oppression, right? So this question of systemic equity and this question of undoing defaults at a systemic level has to do with using language that does not sort of take for granted that the people, that your audience knows what you're talking about, right? It's the idea of not of describing in a book, describing every character's hair texture and every character's eye color and every character's skin color, because right now the only ones that aren't described are the folks who are white. White becomes this normal, and only the folks that deviate from whiteness in some way as characters need to be described so that you know what they look like. Because if you aren't specific, then your audience is just going to assume they're white, and they probably will be right. And actually, this screenshot that I have over here is one of my favorites. It pops up on my Facebook feed regularly because I reshare it so much. But it's just a Tumblr screenshot where somebody says is sort of giving an example of this in action, where you can say you have people in fandom. So really any fandom, but children's literature and YA certainly works with this as well. So this the person who questions, why does that character have to be queer? Why does that character have to be trans? Why does that character have to be a person of color? And the response should be, why not? Right? Instead of like seating this person and acquiescing to their request for a debate, or even seating the idea that like you are required to justify diversity to them. You just ask why not, and a person responded and said another good response along with why not is to say as opposed to what, and then watch the person try not to say normal, right? It's again this idea of like, why do we have to deviate from the default so much? The default's perfectly fine. It's totally inclusive of everyone. Everyone can relate to a straight white man. And it's like, well, actually they can't. And that matters. And if we're going to undo systemic oppression, we need to acknowledge that it matters. So the other half of this, the oppressive language piece, is what we're trying to work against. So through the language of oppression, through language that works against defaults, that does not assume a viewpoint or a perspective that is from the dominant culture and from systems of oppression, that works against oppressive language. That's what we're trying to undo. So oppressive language is one that reinforces defaults, right? It's one that says phrases like, we need to add diversity to something, to the workforce, to our students, to our curriculum, to our books on the shelf. But that language, that sentence automatically sort of establishes that diversity and what you already have are somehow separate, right? This idea that your collection of books, if you need to add diversity to your collection of books, it's like, well, what is your collection of books if it's not diverse? And do you even have a collection if it's not diverse, etc. The diverse books, right? That's my little pet peeve of trying to use diverse as a descriptor of a single thing. So it's like, oh, this book is really diverse, we should add it to the collection, is another way of saying that diversity is clearly shorthand for something else. Because why is this book not diverse, but this book is diverse? And what is it for you to be adding it to a bunch of books that aren't diverse, et cetera, et cetera? Seat at the table is another phrase that you'll hear a lot and that a lot of folks have recently voiced objection to. It actually is sort of rooted in that concept of paternalism, right? This idea of a table as a universal sort of analogy for an organization. It's like a lot of tables aren't that important to a lot of cultures. And so assuming that they are, or that this reads the same for everybody, you've already sort of erased some folks' experience. And the idea, of course, is that in a system of oppression is that the dominant cultures references the dominant, right? You, as a marginalized person, you have to become an expert about the dominant culture's way of being. They don't need to know anything about you, but you better know how to speak and make yourself visible to them, because if not, you'll be erased, right? And then the last one here is, of course, diversity problem, which is something I say in the article, sort of an ironic way to describe the issue of the diversity void, or the issue of lacking diversity, because diversity isn't the problem, right? Diversity is supposedly supposed to be the solution, right? Diversity is supposed to fix the problem. So why are we naming it as if it's the problem? And this, again, right, we've already gotten messy in our language, which leaves us lots of room to reinforce these systems, because we're not questioning and not sort of interrogating the language as we use it. Okay. All right, so finally, a slide that's not cut off. So folks probably recognize this. They've probably seen it a bunch of times in a bunch of different iterations. I know that there's like a soccer version of this for folks that don't like baseball but do like soccer, which would be me. So I like this image for a lot of reasons. It's a great conversation starter. It's a great place to start for any conversation that's sort of about unpacking this idea of why equity is important, and that equality is not enough. It's also great for folks who can absorb concepts more easily through visuals, right? That's great. But I also have a lot of problems with this, right? For this same question of language, right? And if we expand language to sort of mean any sort of way we communicate, visuals certainly are included in there. So I have a problem with this sort of on the concept level, because not just because I don't like baseball, but also because this is not what any baseball field anywhere looks like. If you've ever been to Boston and seen Fenway Stadium, there is no place along the stadium where you can just, like, peek over a fence and get a view of something. This sort of erases what would happen if you were to try and see a baseball game for free, right? Sports in our country are very rooted in capitalism. And so when you try to see these for free, you are not met with like, oh no, I can't see over the fence. You're often met with violence. And in fact, right, like people in uniforms, like physically throwing you out of spaces. And especially these folks appear to be people of color. They are almost certainly going to be met with violence if they are trying to not pay and still enjoy this sport event. But we'll let that go for the moment. So I do have problems with it at the concept level, but I also have problems with it for what I was talking about earlier, the deficit paradigm, right? So the deficit paradigm, for folks that are not familiar with it, essentially means that you begin to use rhetoric or conceptualize the folks that need the most, like the help that folks need, as somehow an inherent problem to them. So specifically with oppression, the idea that folks are oppressed as an inherent quality of who they are. And so the way that this image sort of interacts with this is that while this is a good example of equity, this idea that equal numbers of boxes for each person doesn't actually fix the problem. Everybody needs what they need. Good, right? But the problem is that the person over here on the right, the left, oh my God, directions. The person all the way over here that needs the most boxes is actually short, right? Actually has the least capacity to see over the fence. And that's not how oppression works, right? And as a matter of fact, that's actually how eugenics works, right? Is this idea that the people, the poor people, the people of color, the people who are just, not able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, are not able to do so because of some inherent flaw in them. And the big problem with this is that actually eugenicists created, like, our standardized testing, which is how we sort of assess the learning capabilities of folks in school, but that's a different conversation. But the idea that this image, right, as much as it is well-intentioned, as much as I think it is a good conversation starter, if this is where you stop, then you have stopped with this perspective that oppression is somehow the fault of or an inherent quality of the people who are oppressed. And you have erased this idea that it is in fact a systemic structural issue, that there are structures in place that disadvantage people who otherwise would be perfectly capable of, quote unquote, seeing over a fence. And so one way that I challenge this in presentations that I give or in conversations is to use this sort of different image myself. And again, I'm sorry it's cut off. But instead of having folks that are different heights, different sizes, right, you've got folks that are more or less the same height, who have the same ability to reach up and grab things. You'll also notice that it is bookshelves instead of baseball, because libraries and books. But it also kind of works in a metaphor for how our society organizes resources, right? Literally out of reach, except for those who have the most privilege, right? So even somebody that's not necessarily actively disadvantaged all the time, right? When we talk about intersectionality, maybe somebody's got a bit of disadvantage, but so many of their identities are ultimately privileged that they move through life okay. They still don't have the same kind of reach that somebody who has the privilege of a box that I know is cut off here has to reach that top shelf. So in reality, right, we're not talking about somebody who's too short to reach. We're talking about somebody who's had a hole dug out from under them systemically, on purpose, intentionally. This is the way the system was built to work. That means that equity efforts, our effort to crush this inequality has to address that systemic disadvantage, right? So this person still gets 2 boxes, but it's about filling the hole, right? It's not about getting them some height that they don't inherently have. It's about filling the hole that was dug out from under them. And hand in hand with equity as a systemic approach comes this question of systemic change, right? So the question of why are the most valuable and important resources up out of reach to begin with? Why is the shelf so high? If we just pushed it down, then so many more people would be able to access these resources. And that systemic change doesn't deny the fact that systems of oppression still operate. It doesn't deny the fact that intersectionality exists. It doesn't deny the fact that there aren't folks that wake up every morning the target of systems meant to harm them, right? We still have that box for the person that has the hole. But by changing the systems that we are able to change, by changing the way we operate within LIS, by interrogating our language, by making sure that our "we welcome everyone" signs are in multiple languages, kinds of decisions, those kinds of systemic changes, we can make a far greater impact than sort of the less than impact, I guess is the way to say it. Whatever is less than impact that sort of has happened because our conversations about diversity in LIS have been happening for decades, literally a minimum of 30 decades, but since the civil rights movement, right? We've been having this conversation and we've seen very little change. Okay. And this is sort of my last piece that actually isn't in the article. It was something I talked about afterwards when I was trying to procrastinate from something else, so I ended up talking a bunch on Twitter. And it is this problem of using diversity as a strategy, as a solution, right? So there's lots of ways to use the word diversity or use diversity and inclusion rhetoric to talk around what we're really trying to address, to use it to not talk about power, to use it to not talk about race, to use it to not talk about oppression. But one way in particular that often pops up in LIS, in higher education, which I'm also sort of like embedded in because I'm an academic librarian, is using diversity as a concept, as a strategy, right? We have no diversity here. We should add diversity, right? This idea that if we fix the diversity, we fix the problem. And that's not it at all. Not if we're taking a systemic approach and not if we're looking at the way that our language and being precise in our language that addresses systemic oppression and problems. So one thing, I said this on Twitter, so diversity is the sunshine that brightens a room when we open the curtains and clean the grime off the windows. It is one result when we dismantle systemic barriers in our fields. And this is essentially the idea of we don't want diversity, or rather we don't want diversity as a strategy, we want equity as a strategy. If equity is where our strategy is embedded, then diversity is what we will see when our equity is successful. If our equity efforts actually do their job, then diversity is how we can tell that they've done it, right? It's a metric. It's not a strategy, it is a result. It's an objective. And as soon as we move, right, move our language and move our actual action into engaging equity and justice rather than focusing on, well, add diversity where we don't have diversity, is where we actually can make impact and see greater diversity because the systemic barriers have come sort of crashing down and allowing people in. And the last thing I will say, which is a little bit more pertinent to our moment in time, is a reminder that talk is not action, that our language practices in LIS and pretty much any organization that uses diversity and inclusion rhetoric above all else often ends up framing the discussion you're having as action to address the issues you're ultimately bringing up, and that's not how it works. And so my example here is how many folks have wanted, calling essential workers hero, right? Grocery store workers, healthcare workers, folks in restaurants, folks that are running Instacart to bring people groceries, etc., calling them heroes. And that's lovely, right? That's nice. Diversity is the spice of life. Happy talk, very nice. They're heroes. They're amazing. They're so great for doing this. But what it's not is actual action that systemically impacts those folks' lives, that if they're heroes, that they kind of deserve, right? Things like hazard pay, getting paid more because they are at risk to improve the comfort of those of us who are at home. Paid sick leave so that they don't, have to be homeless because they get sick with a virus during a pandemic. And raising the minimum wage, because if it proves that these jobs are in fact as essential as we thought they were, as we didn't think they were, then we should raise the minimum wage to acknowledge that, right? So this idea of talk not being action, action is action. And I'm going to stop talking now because that was a lot. And I will just say, are there any questions that I can answer for folks?
Amazing as always. Thank you so very much. All right, so the questions are starting to come in. I think this first, okay, just making sure which one is a question and which is a comment. Okay, so Alana is talking, friend is an ICU nurse, and she says calling her a hero is just you making it okay for yourself when she dies. Oh dear, yes. Ethan concurs as an essential worker. Okay, Emily says, do you have thoughts on the We Need Diverse Books campaign, specifically wondering about the name of the organization itself?
I, I mean, yes, I do. But I will say that We Need Diverse Books started as a hashtag, as so many powerful movements recently have. It was quite literally a social media movement before it was, the organization that it now is. So I will say the name carryover makes sense to me. So it's sort of I wouldn't change it now, I guess is my answer. And the idea again of sort of like engaging with the rhetoric that's happening, right? So this idea of diverse books and whatnot. This is sort of like somebody is someday going to do a dissertation looking at a critical discourse analysis of hashtags that have been used in various movements around equity and around anti-oppression, maybe specifically within children's literature. Hint, hint. Anybody in the class, go ahead. I'd love to see it. So I would say at this point, when it happened, when the hashtag happened, when the hashtag blew up, when so many folks started using this as a rallying cry of, yes, I've never seen myself in books. I'm decades old. I didn't see myself before. I don't see myself now. I don't see my kids in these books, et cetera, et cetera. I would say it's the power of that hashtag is less about the fact that it uses diverse to describe a book, but more the idea that the way hashtags work, you need something that's going to catch and hold meaning immediately. And so yes, if I was creating it, I probably would have said something else. But the fact that it used the language that it did, it took off exactly the way that it did. And so no, I wouldn't change it at all. And I'd say that it lives in a sort of different space, which maybe requires a different analysis.
All righty. Catherine wants to know, what do you say to an administration that says the quote unquote reason we do not have more POC is because POC are not applying for library positions, as in, this is not our problem?
So that's fun. Classic avoidance is great. And I'll say right now, there's only so much you can do about an administration that digs in their heels, again, because that's how power works. We are never sort of outside of a system of power, in your classroom, as a worker in whatever institution you work at. The people that have power to make the decision and make the call are always going to be that. And which is only to say, there's only so much you can push directly at them. And maybe you'll have more luck with the, ask forgiveness instead of permission kind of approach, et cetera, et cetera. But to an administration that says that POC aren't applying to these jobs, one, they're wrong. And I wouldn't immediately go, you're wrong, and in a meeting, I wouldn't do that. But I would say maybe could I ask you for some data to back up what you just said? Because if your basis for this is the fact that they're not applying to our library or whatnot, then I'm going to say that there's going to be some things affecting that, and it's not necessarily a question of causation, but more a question of correlation and things like that, right? So ask for data and be prepared to show data to them that says the exact opposite. In fact, people apply to jobs, we have a lot of studies that have been done about literally language. Your name at the top of a resume can stop you from getting a call back. And whatnot. And also, of course, the idea that we have mitigating circumstances, right? We have MLISs is your way into the profession, and not everybody can get an MLIS. So we have plenty of people of color who simply can't, that are working at lower levels of a library staff organization that can't apply to higher positions that hold impact and whatnot because they don't have the MLIS. That's not always the case, but it's a place to start. So like data is often a great place to start because the data tells us that in fact people do exist. Black and brown librarians, BIPOC librarians exist. We're here, and some of us have managed to get past those barriers in one respect or another. But like we're here and we exist, and the notion of simply erasing us as well, we're just not applying is overly simplistic, and I would question where they get their data from as a place to start.
Just to piggyback on Stacy, argue as well that part of that phrase, that POC are not applying, is really about we don't think they're a qualified POC. We don't think that they're a POC that would fit, quote unquote, in our library. So again, with the language, this particular phrase could mean a variety of different things.
Right. And that question, right, about good librarianship, oh, they don't
Yeah.
seem like a qualified librarian, also very much. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Elaine says, how do we get our management and staff to understand these issues at more than a surface level? We have an equity committee, but you can see where the ability to make systemic change as well as affect individual understanding seems so difficult.
hmm I mean, if you have an equity committee that is ultimately toothless, right, that doesn't have any kind of say over this is right, any committee that is built to make recommendations to the actual people that hold power is going to be a committee that's ultimately doing nothing but what the people in power think is valuable, right? That's not going to necessarily be a pathway to change. Sometimes it might be, right? We're all people, and sometimes the people that hold power are committed to change, and that's great, but often they're not. And in part because real change means redistribution of power. So, which is to say, understanding this beyond a surface level is a matter of learning and unlearning, right? This is something that folks need to explore through education. You have to learn about this, right? It is entirely true that you can be ignorant of so many different issues because you've not been exposed to them, because the bubble in which you live, the circles in which you move simply have not exposed you to it, and that's real. But ignorance is treatable. Ignorance is something that can be addressed, right, through education. Actually, I have a LibGuide, anti-oppression LibGuide through Simmons that in part was put together in response to our students. The undergraduate students brought 10 demands to our administration in November of 2015. But afterward, because there was so much discussion about racism now on campus, a lot of these same students who had already voiced this burden of racism happening in their classroom from peers, from professors and whatnot, were having this extra burden of having to prove that something was racist or explain it over and over again to white peers that just didn't understand why is this a problem. And so out of that came the Anti-Oppression Guide, which covers racism and a number of other sort of axes of oppression, to sort of explain. This is background about how this type of oppression operates, the ways that it can show up, the ways that the very most well-meaning of people can enact it, and the ways that it is embedded in the structures of our society and of our institutions. So the Anti-Oppression Guide is actually freely available. It's a place to start. If that's a question from a real life example, and you want to give folks a place to start, I always recommend self-education, like go to Google, go to the guides, go to the resources that folks have already poured a bunch of labor into before you ask for intellectual labor on the part of folks that live in this oppression. But always keep in mind that your learning should be driven by the folks who live in the oppression. It should be guided by the folks who live in the oppression, because that's how you fight systems that marginalize, is by centering the folks that it marginalizes. So I would say starting there, starting with let's actually commit to understanding this at a beyond a surface level. And if it's going to take things like rewriting a policy, if it's going to take putting questions in a performance review about how your work has engaged with this, that, and the other, then understanding it is going to become part and parcel of the job, no matter what someone's personal feelings about it might be. Right? This is about changing. It's about changing folks' behavior through education, about how their behavior has impact on patrons and on their fellow staff, and that's very much within the wheelhouse of performance and organizational sort of policies.
Okay, so I did add the URL for the LibGuide into the chat box. So Dylan is asking a question. Since diversity as a term in libraries seems to deflect from challenging issues, what would be a better term to use in order to combat hatred, racism, persecution, oppression in a way that can be understood succinctly?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and that last bit is important, right? Because we have a lot of terms that challenge oppression, or that unmask it, that are new, right? I think I used the term transmisia earlier at the beginning of this mountain of words, and folks may not be as familiar with that as the word transphobia. Right, so using misia as a suffix instead of phobia, which phobia is Greek for fear and misia is Greek for hatred, is the short of it. Actually, I talk about it in the guide, if you're curious about more. But this idea that the language that is challenging these systems, that's challenging these power dynamics, are often new phrases, new words, or they seem new, or giving current words different concepts behind them, right? And it has to do with the fact that you have folks who have been marginalized, whose voices have not been heard, are now starting to be heard. And part of being heard is saying, I'm going to describe myself. I'm going to describe me and my people and my experience in my own words, not the words that have been handed to me by this system and culture of oppression. So equity, I think, is a good place to start. I think simply defining terms can be a good place to start for an organization. So like, you can continue using the word diversity, but you need to sit down as a staff, as an organization, and say what we mean by diversity is rooted in anti-oppression. It is not about, oh, we need to have, a percentage of difference among this, and this. It is context specific, historically informed, and it is about shifting the needle on anti-oppression and challenging oppression and systemic barriers where we see them. That is what diversity means. So don't come in here with your diversity of thought is more important than diversity of, I don't know, hair color, whatever. And don't come in here with your devil's advocacy and whatnot, right? Being clear, being transparent in what you mean is a good place to start. But if you're looking for a different word, I think equity and anti-oppression say what they mean, which in the best of circumstances, all words should. So that can, anti-oppression, again, it's more syllables. It even has a dash. So like, it's harder, but that, like I say, like the words that challenge oppression, it's always the words that challenge oppression, the language that challenges oppression is always more work than the language that reinforces it, because that's how the system works. If it's easier to describe a group of people this way, if it's easier to, erase this experience and use these words that are not inclusive enough, that means it's where oppression lives, right? Of course, it's easier to continue the system as it is as opposed to challenge it. So yeah, equity and anti-oppression, I think, are good places to start. Maybe you need a smaller shift than that. So maybe incorporating it we see that more and more. Instead of diversity and inclusion, we're seeing equity, diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity and inclusion. Nobody says diversity, inclusion, and equity because the acronym spells DIE, and nobody wants to deal with that. But you're seeing equity being sort of part of this dyad has more and more. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but I would say equity or anti-oppression, good place to start.
Perfect. Ben is asking, how do you see our current moment impacting these efforts towards affecting positive systematic change? How do we keep the conversation going, keeping things moving in libraries and in the LIS field? Does it become more difficult?
Does it become more difficult? I'd say it becomes, I think it's the same amount of difficult. I think what happens is that the folks that are not actually committed to change, or they're not there yet, right? This takes effort, exhausting, lifelong effort. And the change that we're looking for is not necessarily change that we'll see in our lifetime, right? But the effort is still worth it, and the folks that are committed to it, and this is, you'll see this in a number of places in the guide, but also other sort of anti-oppression outlets online that you'll find talking about this. This idea that allyship is in fact sort of an insufficient model, and what we really are talking about is co-conspirators, is something that's used. Folks that are in it as much as the people are that are assuming the same amount of risk as the people who live in the oppression are, right? Not somebody who's just sort of sitting on the sidelines and reading books, and then like is very excited to be the most educated person in the room. That's not it. So I don't think it gets more difficult. I think it's the same amount of difficult. I think what will happen is you'll move into spaces where the conversation is no longer welcome, right? So that's another way that this works, right? Is even if we're having the conversations, they tend to be relegated to particular places. Oh, that's something you'll talk about in your diversity course in MLIS. It's not necessarily something we talk about here in cataloging. Not if you've got a good cataloging professor. The absolutely is a conversation you'll have. But if you don't, if that's not the way if that's not what you're working with, it's not the way it's built, you'll find that suddenly your continued question of, well, why don't we have more terms that are derived from the community themselves? Why don't we have an established workflow for how you go about getting those terms and working with communities to describe those terms? And by the way, this does in fact exist, but in general, right? So suddenly you're finding that asking that question every week, or asking a version of that question every week, it suddenly becomes unwelcome. It suddenly starts to feel like you're intruding, and you feel that way because people are making you feel that way. You'll find that as you're bringing this up in line in the exhibit hall as you're waiting for a free book, that folks are like, why are you bringing that up now? I don't want to talk about that uncomfortable thing right now. Or I don't want to talk about it in a way that implicates me, or I don't want to talk about it in a way that actually makes me uncomfortable as I continue standing in this line. I'm just trying to get this free book. You'll find that the conversation becomes unwelcome if it is brought out of the spaces that the powers that be feel is where it is supposed to be. And the point, of course, is that it is supposed to be everywhere. That is how we actually get change. So no, I don't think it gets more difficult. I do think it requires practice, right? You have to practice how you bring up these questions. You have to think about what is the most effective way to use my voice for marginalized folks, on behalf of marginalized folks, to uplift their voices with my voice, etc. And it takes stamina, right? Practice and stamina, so that when you suddenly are having this conversation in a place where it's not welcome, that you don't back down. So our current moment is an interesting litmus test, to see who has the stamina right now and who needs to work on the stamina. But I don't think it gets more difficult. I don't think it's gotten more difficult since the 60s. I don't think it's gotten easier since the 60s. I think it's just been moved to different spaces where sometimes it's welcomed and sometimes it's not. And so the practice of having the conversation, the practice of looking at it every time, the practice of being the killjoy, there it is, the practice of being the Debbie Downer, the stamina to sit through it and move with it, and continue bringing it up, is the important piece.
All right. I have a question from Ayula. I hope I'm saying your name right.
Iola.
Iola, thank you. Could you say more about your dislike of the idea of focusing on diversity of thought? I've heard a lot recently about how cosmetic diversity leads to tokenism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's actually That's a good answer to your question, as a matter of fact. Yes, diversity of thought, devil's advocacy, the whole there. If this kind of diversity matters, then doesn't this kind of diversity matter, right? That comes back to that false equivalency part, and it comes back to that we haven't been context specific. We have not been clear enough. We have assumed that everybody understood what we meant by diversity, and we did not want to make people uncomfortable. So we've gone and left this door open for, well, why isn't diversity of thought as valuable as racial diversity, as valuable as diversity of ability, neurodiversity, gender diversity, gender expansiveness, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this not equivalent? And the answer is because it's not. And the notion that you have to argue and justify why is not, it's sometimes something you have to learn, right? Like if somebody's actually looking to be educated, if someone's actually looking for your intellectual labor to take it and fill a gap, that's great. And you got to learn. It takes time to learn, like who's actually thirsty for your knowledge and who is actually Nestle and is just coming to take it and rebottle it and repackage it as not what you wanted it to be, and at the same time draining you. So the question of diversity of thought, I have nothing against diversity of thought. I think diversity of thought is a natural consequence of being in a room of multiple human beings. That's just how it works. That there are as many ways of thinking as there are people on the planet, and that's a good thing. But it's James Baldwin, right? And I'm going to get the quote wrong, but we can have diversity of thought. We can disagree, right, and still love each other, unless your disagreement, unless your diversity of thought, your difference of thought, is rooted in my oppression, and is rooted in my non-existence, right? So the moment we cross that line is where diversity of thought no longer has value. It holds risk and danger and difference of risk and danger for different people in the room. And the moment that kind of thought, the moment of thought that's rooted in oppression, comes with a person who also holds a great deal of power, and that might be the decision-making power in a library to select books. It might be the decision-making power in a library to spread out budget. It might be the decision-making power in a governing body to make a law, to make a regulation, to say, or in an organization to say that natural hairstyles are unprofessional. Those kinds of decisions that come from a diversity of thought that is rooted in other people's oppression. That is not okay. And if we are clearer in our rhetoric about anti-oppression, about equity, about what it is we are actually striving for, which is the protection of the dignity and lives of actual human beings whom we serve and who we work with, then we drive out this notion of diversity of thought that these sort of trolls are arguing for. If you're arguing for actual diversity of thought, the fact that an MLIS makes for an administration that is high, that has a real that's not a good word to say, that has a interesting commitment to academia, that is committed to the idea of the importance of an academic perspective within the running of libraries, right? If everybody has an MLIS, then everybody kind of has that sort of thought in common, if only because they all put thousands of dollars into getting an MLIS. If you're interested in that diversity of thought, in the idea that shouldn't there be more non-academic perspective and viewpoints and whatnot, considering how much work in anti-oppression movements grassroots movements have come out of non-academic spaces and non-academic viewpoints, that I will have a conversation with you about. But if you're saying diversity of thought matters because I'm just gonna troll and argue that if this diversity matters, then all diversity should matter, that's just all lives matter talk, right? That's just a way to erase the specific challenges we are trying to address. And again, don't know if that answered the question, but I do agree with the diversity of thought thing being a nice spiral into tokenism, right? This idea of like, well, we've got one, so we don't need more. We have the diversity, right? So again, it comes back to saying what we mean, and what we mean is challenging these systems, and we can lay out what these systems look like and what they're doing, what they have historically done, and so we can lay out plans for how we're going to challenge them, and they do not include, well, your diverse panel doesn't have a cishet white dude on it, and isn't that its own kind of racism? The answer is no, it's not, and I don't need to explain it more than that.
Okay. um, our last question will come from Ethan. And Ethan says, in terms of diversity of the field, do you predict any significant changes within the next couple of decades?
Ooh, the next couple of decades. I mean, I really, really hope so. Um, we've I'd like to say that the fact that we are having these conversations and that they are so prolific and prevalent that the needle must be shifted somehow, and in many spheres and spaces we are seeing it, not I think overall yet, and that I think has to do with that balances of power have not yet shifted. We do not have enough changes in the ways that libraries work, um, to account for a huge shift yet. Um, I'd love to see. I mean, libraries are a long held institution, and change comes slowly to us, if only because the people that are in power tend to have gotten there because they have moved and flowed with dominant cultures and dominant voices. And so resistance to change is one, also a resistance of power redistribution and whatnot. That the way things have always been done is somehow a reasonable argument. Um, I hope that the fact that we're talking about this and that we are learning to talk about it better, that we're learning to talk about it more effectively, that we are moving away from what's called the business case for diversity, right? This idea that this impacts our bottom line, that diversity is good for us. In the corporate world, it's good for their bottom line of profit. In the library world, it's good for our bottom line of working with our communities and getting more people in the library, and getting more staff, right? We're gonna have more people interested in becoming part of libraries, like that. That's all great. But at the bottom of this is work that is about shifting societal systems that harm fellow human beings. And the library being a cultural institution, we have that kind of we have the capacity for that cultural impact that we should be embracing, for justice and equity that it holds. So I hope to see that kind of change. At the same time, we just had Leanne Lowe's diversity audit, I guess is one way to say it. Their survey, the results showed very little change since the last time they did the diversity check. And that's understandable, right? That's again that talk, that's not action. A lot of folks having initiatives, a lot of folks trying to recruit more, a lot of folks using diversity as a strategy to fix this problem that in part Leanne Lowe was helped sort of show within the publishing world. And a lot of that hasn't resulted in change because it's again sort of focusing efforts in the wrong place, or not in the wrong place. It's an okay place to focus efforts, but it's missing key components to actually make it have impact. But we're seeing that result now, right? We're like, oh, hey, this didn't work at all. Maybe we should try something else. We have more folks coming out of MLIS programs who are saying, where is this conversation about how racism is present in our libraries, how we impact communities, how there are whole communities not even coming to the library because we have already closed our doors to them, effectively closed our doors to them in our practices, in our rules, in our sort of way of presenting ourselves. So I hope so. If we give it a nice long timeline, if by a couple of decades we mean 4 or 5, we could see some real and lasting change. Certainly some change enough change in circumstances, enough change in our leadership, in how we qualify leadership, right? We're gonna see some deans of library positions and some directors of library positions, and I don't know, the leadership within our networking organizations that suddenly thorough understanding and engagement in your work with anti-oppression, tenets of equity, and whatnot are going to become a qualifying factor of leadership. And suddenly it's not going to be leaders who are also learning. It's going to be leaders who already know, have already done things, and are ready to help the folks that they work with and that they lead along, come along with them. That I think is where we'll see a real like sort of floodgate change. And I'm looking forward to it. Like I'm excited to see it start to happen. Um, and unless we have like pandemics or whatnot, we really are we're really sort of heading in that direction. So it's good.
And on that note, everyone, please join me in thanking Stacey Collins for joining us today. It is always a pleasure to have you join us and talk to us about language and oppression and read and all of the great things that you're doing. So, and to everyone attending, always happy to see the students here live in the session. And for those who will watch the recording, you're in for a treat, or you have been in for a treat. And for our guests that joined us for the broadcast today, thank you so much for joining us, especially during difficult times. So thank you all. All best wishes for continued health and safety, and let's continue to do this diversity work. Thank you, Stacy. All right, everyone have a good night. Thank you.